Are you doing the record? I love that record, Papa.
Hello everybody, thank you once again for tuning in to the Eden Audio YouTube channel, and as I promised I was going to present to you 15 of the most influential vinyl albums that I have in my record collection. Now as I run through this list, one thing is going to become particularly obvious to you, and that is the decade of the music that I'm going to show you. I grew up in the 80s. I'm an 80s youth. I became interested in music when I was a teenager. So the 80s music has a huge influence on my personal life. So as I go through these albums, you'll notice that 99.9% of the albums that I'm about to show you are from the 80s. So, to get the ball rolling, we're going to start off with album number 15. Now this is quite an unusual choice for me because simply I don't particularly like live recording albums. I'm quite happy watching a DVD or a Blu-ray of a concert, but actually listening to an album of a live recording doesn't do that much for me. I don't like to hear the crowd cheering or people clapping while I'm listening to music. So it's quite unusual that this album made it into my list, and that album is this one here. Not sure if you can see that. It's called Dance Craze, and it was released on the Two Tone record label. Dance Craze, the best of British ska, and it featured top bands of the time that included Bad Manners, The Beat, The Body Snatchers, Madness, The Selector, and finally The Specials. Also, Dexys Midnight Runners made a brief appearance on this tour. Now, what's quite remarkable about this album is that how they managed to get these bands to tour together when we consider that there was probably 6 bands, and each of those bands probably had 6 or 7 members in those bands, and the age group of those bands were probably late teenagers. Or maybe a couple of them were in their early 20s, maybe 21 or 22. Think about that for a moment. 6 bands consisting of all those teenagers going on a tour around the whole of the UK. Quite remarkable. And I also recommend, if you can, try and check out, they made a video. They recorded the concert and they made a video also called Dance Crazy. Possibly you might find it on YouTube, but try and check it out and you can just see the raw energy that was behind that tour. Completely different. It looks dated, completely different to what we would expect to see in a tour today. But back then, the lads that was maybe 12, 13, 14, 15 absolutely loved the raw energy that was behind the two-tone movement. So do try and check that out. I imagine this is probably quite a rare album now to get hold of, and the footage is probably quite rare to see, but do try and check it out if you're into two-tone, ska type of music. Definitely worth checking out. An absolute gem of an album, that one really is. Moving on to the next one, I must say I love the Motown record label. It's one of my favourite all-time record labels, and one of the bands that were on the Motown record label was a band called the Commodores. The lead singer of the Commodores was a Mr. Lionel Richie, and in the early 80s he went on a solo career. He was probably at his peak in the early 80s, and one of his albums that he released at that time was called this, Can't Slow Down. Now this is quite a unique album in a way, because when you look at the songs that are contained on this album, you would notice that probably most of them, if not all of them, were actually released as singles here in the United Kingdom. When we look at side 1, we've got Can't Slow Down, All Night Long, Penny Lover, Stuck on You. I'm sure they were all released as singles. What about side 2, Love Will Find a Way? Now the next one I'm not too sure about, The Only One. I'm not sure that was actually released as a single, but Running with the Night, and probably his most famous track on this album. We all know it, don't we? Because it reached #1, and that is Hello. So just by running through the list of tracks that are found on this album, it's quite easy to see why it made my top 15 list, because again, it's an album full of timeless songs, songs that you can still enjoy today. As I say, Motown, I really love that classic sound of the Motown artist. Really good, that Lionel Richie. Now, this next one's an interesting one. I don't really know why I put this in my record list. When I was a teenager, I grew up in Essex, and what we used to do on the weekend is I used to go out with my friends, and we used to go to two places. We used to go to Wickford, and they used to have a record store there called Adrian's, or we would go into Southend. But in this particular time era, there was one album that you would always hear, and that was this album here, Sade and Diamond Life. As I say, it doesn't matter what record store you would go into, what cafe you would go into, what shopping mall you would go into, or shopping centre, whatever you call it here in England. Shopping mall, more American, isn't it? What shopping centre you would go into, it didn't matter. It seems like this album followed you wherever you went. It was played continuously everywhere, and really, when you listen to it, you could understand why, because it was such a chilled out, relaxing album to listen to. Sade had a lovely husky voice, and it was just relaxing, smoothing, calming effect it had on you when you listened to her singing to you. And probably the track that was probably most played on this album was Smooth Operator. Do you remember that track? I'm sure we do. And we also have Your Love Is King, Hang On To Your Love. Again, I say it was one of those albums to unwind to if you were feeling stressed or nervous about something. You put this on your turntable, listen to it, and after listening to it, I'm sure it's like a medicine. It would make you feel much better after you'd listened to that one for a little while. The next one, Frankie Says. Now, do you remember that? Everyone used to have those white t-shirts on it. Frankie Says. And it's probably Frankie Says Relax. Do you remember? I'm sure you do. If you were a teenager back there in the 80s, I'm sure you remember seeing those t-shirts. What a controversial band. Frankie Goes to Hollywood were. Why were they controversial? Well, probably Mike Reid had something to do with that. Mike Reid, the DJ of Radio 1. He probably sent Frankie on their way by banning their single, Relax. As soon as that single became Relaxed, everyone became curious as to why it was banned, and I think everyone went out and bought it. Relax. Yeah. And this album, I actually didn't buy this one in the UK. I think you can see, I think I bought this one when I was living in Spain, because where I lived in Spain, there was this tiny little record shop on the corner, little corner record shop, tiny little thing it was, about the size of a bedroom, based in Los Beliches, which is close to Fengirola down there in Andalusia in southern Spain. As I say, I picked that album up in there. And what's good about this album is that it comes in two parts, so you get great value for money. Not only do you get great songs on this album, it's great value for money, as I say, because you get two vinyls that are included in it. And I say it is such a brilliant album. It's got Two Tribes, Relax, The Power of Love. Brilliant album. It really is. And just to show how good Frankie Goes to Hollywood are, or were, should I say, is that if you check out YouTube, they had a reunion tour in about 2010-ish, 2011. Unfortunately, though, it didn't feature Holly Johnson. Holly Johnson, of course, being the lead singer of Frankie Goes to Hollywood. He didn't want to participate in this reunion. Sadly, but someone else took his place. But as I say, try and check out that concert. It is still on YouTube, and listen to it, and it will shock you just how good those songs were, how fantastic it sounds live. I know when I saw it, I was taken in by just how good Frankie Goes to Hollywood were live. brilliant. As I say, it's a shame that Holly Johnson refused to participate in it. But the lead singer that stood in does an absolutely classic job on it. He really does. Very, very good. So here we are at number 11 of my 15 most influential albums. And that is by probably Britain's most successful reggae band. Who am I talking about? I'm sure you all know. UB40. Now, this album is before UB40 became, I would say, sort of a much more commercial sound. At this time period, UB40 was still sort of writing their own songs, where later on in their career they tended to do a lot more covers, which I didn't like. I did prefer their earlier material. Now, the album I've got here, I'm going to show it to you. Not sure if you remember that album. It wasn't their debut album, but I think it was their follow-on album called Present Arms. The title track of the album, again, is another classic UB40 sound with those trumpets and trombones, which I absolutely adore. I really love the sound of brass instruments. But that's not the reason why this album appears in my list. This album is on my list for one specific song, and that song is probably my all-time favourite UB40 track. The song I'm talking about is 1 in 10. And the reason that that track is on there is because of the lyrical content of that song. When you read the lyrics of that song and when you hear the way Ali Campbell sings that song, it's touching, it's moving. You see what kind of world that we're living in, the problems, the things that go on in this world is what UB40 is singing about in 1 in 10. It's a sad song, it's a touching song. And it's my favourite ever UB40 song. And that is the pure reason of the many, many good albums UB40 have released. Give them their credit, they do release fantastic albums. But for that one song, UB40 Present Arms makes it at number 11 in my all-time list. And now we arrive then at the top 10 most influential albums in my record collection. At number 10 we have another one of those ska bands, one of the two-tone bands, and that is the British band The Beat. In the States they're actually known as the English Beat, but here in the home of the UK they were affectionately known as The Beat. The main lead singers of The Beat were Dave Wakeling and Rankin Roger, who sadly just over a year ago passed away. The Beat recorded probably 4 or 5 albums, but this one here is probably my favourite of the Beat albums. I just can't stop it, and it contains, as I say, some of those classic ska sounding singles. I'm sure you recognise the Mirror in the Bathroom, Hands Off She's Mine, and probably their most successful single that they released, and that was a cover of an Andy Williams track called I Can't Get Used to Losing You. 1980 this album, and the good thing about The Beat is that they had very high production values on their LP, especially this one. It's very crisply recorded, very clear sounding, especially for the time era it was recorded, I say in the 80s. It had a very nice clear tone to this record. As I say, it is my favourite album from The Beat. Moving on, we arrive at a band that it was one of those bands, again, it was one of those bands that you would think would go on to have an absolutely massive career, but they didn't. Or I don't think they did. I don't recall them having much success after their debut album. I don't think they even released a follow-on album. If someone knows any better, please correct me, let me know in the comments below. But as far as I'm aware, they released this one album, and it was a brilliant album. The Christians, and the self-entitled The Christians. The lead singer had such a lovely, husky, soulful voice. I enjoyed listening to him so much. It was an LP that was played continuously on my turntable as a teenager. I think I was working in London at the time when I purchased this LP, and it's an LP, as I say, that contains some absolutely fantastic singles. All were released and all were very successful, as if I recall correctly. Ideal World, Forgotten Town, Hooverville, When the Finger Points. As I say, the Christians were a band that you would have thought would have gone on to have huge success year after year, but they didn't. They just seemed to fade away and fizzle out. Does anyone know the reason why? Because I don't. Shame, but it is a really good album If you haven't got it in your collection, try and give it a listen. Really, really, really is very good to listen to. Now, the next one. We all know who this is. It's the King of Pop. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. And I bet you think you know what album I'm going to be showing you. And you're going to be wrong. Because when we think of the King of Pop, Michael Jackson, I'm sure all of us think of Thriller. And you'll be right to think so. It is a classic album with so many fantastic pop songs on it. A hugely, hugely successful album. An album that sold millions and millions of copies the world round. Michael Jackson deserved to be called the King of Pop. Thriller deserved to have the huge amount of success it did. But that doesn't mean it made it into my list, or it doesn't mean it was my favourite Michael Jackson album. I prefer the album, the one previous to that. I don't think it was actually called the King of Pop by the time this one was actually released. And this one is called Off the Wall. Again, it's an album that was produced the same as Thriller by Quincy Jones. It's got that sonic signature of Quincy Jones, but I just prefer, I don't know why, I just prefer listening to Off the Wall for some reason. It seems a little bit more smoother. Don't know, I can't explain really why. But again, it's an album that's got classic Michael Jackson songs on it. Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, Rock With You, Off the Wall, The Romantic Girlfriend. So you can see it's another typical Michael Jackson album that's just full of absolutely beautiful pop songs. Love him, hate him, you've got to admit Off the Wall is a timeless classic. Now, moving on to the next album, I'm sure all lads of my age group, of a certain age, are going to remember this woman. How gorgeous and how beautiful she was. As soon as you saw her on TV, you start drooling. Who am I talking about? Debbie Harry, aka Blondie. And I think it was my sister actually that was more aware of Blondie before I was. I think my sister actually had this album in her collection before me. And it's this one here. Parallel Lines, Blondie. Beautiful and an absolutely classic American pop. Now, this is probably the only album that I say I've got in my list that isn't actually from the 80s. I think this one was 78 or 79. Yeah, London. Chrysalis. God, my eyesight. Chrysalis Records Limited, 1978. So as I say, this one just before the 80s. And I say, classic pop, timeless classic pop. You think of albums that are released today. How many albums that you listen to from, say, for example, the year 2000, how many of them are you going to be listening to in 40, 50, 60 years' time? Not many, but things like this we're going to be listening to for probably the next 40, 50, 60 years. Why? Because it contains classic singles such as Hanging on the Telephone, One Way or Another, Picture This, Will Anything Happen, Sunday Girl, Heart of Glass. The list goes on and on and on of absolutely classic pop songs. Songs that we all know the lyrics to. Songs we love singing along to. Blondie, Parallel Lines. It will go on forever and ever. I'm so glad I was born in the 80s and I could listen to fantastic albums such as this. We were privileged, weren't we? We really were. And now, finally, we move into my top 5 all-time favourite vinyl albums. What are they going to be? Well, let's have a look, shall we? Number 5, this one here, Human League Dare. Now why Human League Dare? Quite simply, for me, this album was just way ahead of its time. It really was. It was unbelievably good. It was an album that stood the test of time for ages. If you listen to it now, in 2020, I must admit, it does sound dated, but not back then when it was released. It was, to me, it felt an album that was just way ahead of its time. The tracks on it were just superb. And I'm sure anybody that goes to karaoke, unfortunately, will recognise that one of the most famous tracks ever on this LP, and that is Don't You Want Me Baby. But as I say, it was an album that it was electronic synth music that to me was just so ahead of its time. And again, it was one of those albums that was constantly being played on my turntable at home. And without a shadow of doubt, it deserves to be in my top 5 of all time favourite top 15 most influential album tracks. I love that. The Human League there, absolutely highly recommended. As I say, I was a huge reggae fan. I still am. I still love my reggae music. But as I said, UB40 were probably Britain's most successful reggae band. Everybody will know UB40. But for me, even though they were probably the most successful, they weren't the best. The best, without a shadow of doubt, were the mighty Aswad. Absolutely loved Aswad. And this, to me, Aswad released a number of albums, but to me this album was released just before they reached the peak of their success. When Aswad started out, they didn't have a commercial reggae sound. They were a roots reggae band. So commercial success for them was quite difficult to come by. It didn't come till much later on in their career. And this album, To the Top, was released probably just before they started to have their really big, successful UK success. The album just was so powerful, so rich sounding. The bass on it was so deep, especially when you put on, say for example, on side B, if you put on Nuclear Soldier, as soon as you drop that needle, your stylus hit that black vinyl, and the bass punch and power that came out from this record was something to behold. It was, it made your intestines shake with the depth of the bass, and the power and scowl of this album is absolutely brilliant. As I say, check it out, Nuclear Soldier. It's on side B, first track on side B. Brilliant, beautiful, deep, rich, lovely reggae music. And as I say, Aswad, I think later on in their career they lost their way. They lost that classic British roots reggae sound, and the sound became strange later on in their career. But if you get some of their early stuff, and just when they were becoming commercial, you'll get the best of still how good Aswad are. The later stuff, it's probably not really worth paying much attention to, but try and check out if you can To the Top. Such a classic album. Now we move into the top 3 most influential albums in my record collection, and sitting at number 3 is an unusual choice because it's this one here from The Specials, even though The Specials are probably my next favourite band after Madness. More Specials is slightly different to the first album that The Specials made. Their first album was entitled The Specials, and it was produced by Elvis Costello, and it had a more sort of traditional Trojan ska sound to it, where they covered classic Trojan record singles. Where More Specials, the Specials at this point were beginning to move away from that classic ska sound, and Jerry Dammers, sort of the leader of the Specials, was wanting to explore different sort of genres of music, and the sound had changed to a more sort of what they call muzak. And this is the album from The Specials that I bought first, even though it was the one that was released second. And I bought this because it had on it the single Do Nothing. And what's interesting is that even though the album contains Do Nothing, the single version is far nicer to listen to than the version that's actually found on the album. And the reason for this is that the album version, it removes a couple of chords, a couple of synth chords that are on the single, and you take that away and the track loses some of its specialness, some of its magic, which is a bit of a shame. As I say, I prefer much more the version that The Specials released as an actual single. And also you will find on this album Actually, you'll find it on no special album that the specials released, and that is the massively successful single Ghost Town. But this one, as I say, it contains a Stereotype, Do Nothing. I say, if you're a specials fan, I'm sure most of you will have that record in your vinyl collection. Right, number 2. Who's at number 2? We've had the king of pop. Now it's time for the king of reggae. Yes, Bob Marley undeservedly deserves to be in there. Now, this album is remarkable. Why is it so remarkable? And it's quite simply because this album, would you believe it? This album still, even today, appears in the UK top 100 albums. Think about that for a minute. Even today, Bob Marley and the Wailers' Legend album is still in the UK album top 100 chart. That is some 40 or almost 40 years of being in the UK album chart. I think I can't remember what year I bought this. I think I bought this in about 82, 84, 1984 it came out. So from 1984 to 2020, this album has been in the UK album chart all that time. Still in there. Even now I think it's sort of number 30. Remarkable. I think everybody in the UK must have a copy on tape, CD or vinyl of Bob Marley and the Way, or a download or whatever of this classic album. And when you look at the tracks on it, it's obvious why everybody wants a copy of this album. Is This Love? No Woman, No Cry, Could You Be Loved? Three Little Birds, Buffalo Soldier, One Love, I Shot the Sheriff, Waiting in Vain, Exodus. The king of reggae. We've got the king of pop. We've undoubtedly got the king of reggae, Mr. Bob Marley. Thank you for such a wonderful, wonderful album. Brilliant. And now, finally, who is at number 1? Who is my all-time favourite vinyl record? Stay tuned to find out. So finally, the moment we've all been waiting for. What is the most influential album that I own in my vinyl record collection? Who is number 1? Now, people who know me, I think the answer is going to be pretty obvious. But for those who don't, let me tell you a little story. When I was about 10 years old, my mum took me to my nan and granddad's house. And there I was in my nan and granddad's house when my auntie came up to me and she gave me a present. And that present was this. Madness. One Step Beyond. I was 10 years old when my auntie gave me that record. At that time in my life, I wasn't really that interested in music. But this was a pivotal point in my life when it came to music. Madness had an absolute massive influence on my life from that point onwards. Madness have always been my favourite band. I remember my auntie giving me that record and my granddad putting that record on his little, you wouldn't call it a hi-fi system, it was one of those all-in-one things people used to have back there in those days. Do you remember you used to have the turntable and a tuner and whatever? It was just in sort of a one big box, about that kind of size. And he gave me a pair of headphones, put them on my head. There I am, 10 years old with these pair of headphones on my head. He put the record on the turntable, picked up the stylus, put it into the groove, and I was greeted by those immortal words from Chas Smash. Hey you, don't watch that, watch this. This is the heavy, heavy monster sound, the nuttiest sound around. The opening track of the One Step Beyond album, the self-entitled One Step Beyond. As a 10-year-old, from that point onwards, I was absolutely hooked on Madness. And for 40 years, as I say, Madness have been my favourite band without a shadow of doubt. I've seen them grow up from being teenagers, a young thugs of maybe 18, 19 years old when they first appeared on Top of the Pops, in 1979, singing The Prince. And now I see Suggs as a 60-year-old man. Never did I envisage that when I was 10 years old in 1979, that Madness would still be doing concerts and making music 40 plus years later. It just did not seem possible. So thank you, Madness. Thank you to the 7 fantastic members of Madness that have given me so much musical pleasure over these last 40 years. It seems remarkable that a band that from that era are still going today. I'll never ever forget the moment I received One Step Beyond, the most influential album that I own in my record collection. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching this little presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've agreed with some of my recommendations. Please let me know in your comments some of your 15 all-time favourite albums and why they've had a influence in your life. Let me know, please. Give me your comments down below. I'd like to know. I'd like to know what other people have listened to, what they've grown up to as a teenager. I hope you've enjoyed the 15 albums that I presented to you. Thanks for watching, everyone. Take care. Have a great day. Enjoy whatever you're doing. Take life easy. Stop worrying. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye now.